Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Careers in Peacebuilding Talk Story series. Today, my name is Jose Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our talk story today will focus on challenging racism in U.S. federal policy, lessons from Grassroots Advocacy with Larissa Sanhueza and Jameelah Lewis. Thank you for joining us today to learn about the journey into the profession. Our sponsors for today's event is the Friends Committee on National Legislation, FCNL, that is a national nonpartisan Quaker organization that lobbies Congress and the administration to advance peace and justice and environmental stewardship. Today, thank you for joining us to examine specific ways that activists and grassroots organizers in the U.S. are advocating for more just and equitable policies on the federal level by meeting directly with legislators, engaging the media, and mobilizing their communities. Ordinary people are influencing decisions made by the U.S. Congress on environmental justice, immigration reform, militarized foreign policy, and more. Our guests today are Larissa Sanhueza, who is a young adult program manager at FCNL for the past 3 years. Larissa has trained and managed programs engaging thousands of young adults in the United States to advocate for congressional action to address gun violence, immigration reform, and environmental justice. Also joining us is Jameelah Lewis, who is the advocacy team's organizer at FCNL, where she supports and mobilizes people across the United States to advocate for peace and justice in federal policy. Jameelah is an experienced activist who's also organizes for racial justice with the Mass Liberation Project in Las Vegas and the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Larissa. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. So you introduced us already, and I really appreciate that. I think we want to know who's on this call as well. And so if you could get in the chat and let us know your name, your pronouns, if you're comfortable. And Jameelah, is there a third thing we want to know?
Yeah, even though I know about half of y'all on this call, where are you from today? I think that it kind of grounds us and centers in where everyone's coming from for their individual perspectives.
Thanks, Jameelah.
Thank you.
All right, so feel free to jump in the chat and introduce yourself whenever. Later on, we're gonna try and engage in some conversation with all of you. We know that this is a talk series and Jameelah and I have lots to say and talk about today, but we also really like to keep these things interactive and learn from the people that join us at these events as well, which is one thing we'll be talking, I think, about throughout our presentation is learning from each other and fostering community in spaces that we exist in together. So unless there's anything else, Jameelah, I can just jump into a little bit of framing and then hand it back to you.
Yeah, no, there's nothing else. I just see some people are entering into the chat. We have Brianna from Illinois, Mary Lou from New Hampshire, Sarah from Baltimore. I've always wanted to say it like that. From Advocacy Team or Advocacy Corps, there's always someone who said Baltimore like that, and I've always wanted to. There's Gladys, who I know is in Las Vegas with now Signs of Hope. And I'm going to pass it back to Larissa to continuously engage us all.
All right, thanks, Jameelah. Okay, so let's just dive in. We're first going to spend a couple minutes talking about the framework, right? Jameelah and I have experience doing advocacy work on various different issues. And because of the many years that we've spent doing this work, we have lots of examples. And we want to get into the specifics of what we do and what we've learned from it. But let's just, keep it kind of general first to frame the conversation. So challenging racism in US federal policy is the title of our talk. And that is a large undertaking. Challenging racism, what does that mean, right? We know we have to do it, so how do we do it? How can we kind of break that down into steps that we can all take? So the one I want to talk about first, before, like I said, handing it back to Jameelah for a bit, is hierarchy, challenging hierarchy. So we can challenge racism in US federal policy and really anywhere by challenging hierarchy. And hierarchy, we know, is a characteristic of white supremacy and of racism. So the people at the very top of this hierarchy have the decision-making power. they get to decide what is going to happen. They get to determine what is the best course of action for the entire group. And oftentimes the people with this decision-making power, with this privilege, are also not experiencing the issues that they are making decisions about, right? Not always the case, but in the way that our system is set up, it is most often the case, especially when it comes to social justice issues, right? So how can we challenge hierarchy in that process? By engaging folks on the ground. They can dismantle racism and militarism through their advocacy, through kind of interrupting the hierarchy and making sure that there is enough power at the base level so that it's coming from the ground up rather than from the top down. And I'm not saying this is achieved overnight. I'm not saying that that decision-making power is stripped away from the top of the hierarchy by organizing in the grassroots. But it does build power that, like I said, can interrupt that hierarchy and challenge it. The way that we do advocacy at FCNL, there's many roles you can take in a social justice movement. And the advocacy role that we often take is the lobbying role. We are going to decision makers and telling our stories and influencing them, attempting to influence them so that they know what we want as a solution. They know what the community needs as a solution. And the more people you organize to do that, the more often you're going to talk to them, the more likely it is that you're interrupting it. That system of, we know what's best, you don't, and we're going to make the decision. No, it's actually, we have the decision-making power, but we're hearing you because we know that you know what's best, and we're going to make that decision. That's where we're trying to head, right? That's the goal. Now, I don't want to say that it is all on us to challenge that hierarchy. It is not only our responsibility to be working on this, right? Where the decision-making power lies, in this case, in federal policy, Congress, there also needs to be work done there. Challenging hierarchy must happen in Congress as well. So I'm gonna talk more about this later, but I'll kind of preview it. I said we work on very specific things, different things, Jameelah and I, and the issue I'm focused on right now in terms of grassroots advocacy is really environmental justice. So I'm working with our climate policy team, organizing around environmental justice. And the bill that we're working on, which I will talk more about later, the bill that we're working on is a great example of a congressional office challenging hierarchy. They actually did basically like an in-person and virtual tour of communities across the United States, asking for input. If we were to create a bill around environmental justice initiatives, what do you need? You do this work in your hometown, in your community, what would you need? And they went through a very long process to actually collect all of that. And the result was a bill that was maybe not physically written by communities around the country. It was still written in an office somewhere on Capitol Hill, but it was written with the words and ideas that came from that consultation. So I really have enjoyed working on that bill because the leading sponsor in the House, they've really talked to us a lot about how they want this to be the model for how policy is created. It's not top down, it is rather bottom up, right? And that does still imply a hierarchy. I think there's a difference between challenging hierarchy and dismantling hierarchy, and we want to do both. But for now, I want to focus on, if we live in a system that has hierarchy, how can we challenge it and just continually chip away at it so that we can reach a place where it is not the people with the most power that are making decisions for everyone else that has no power or say. And I'll hand it off to Jameelah to continue us on this conversation about what it means to challenge racism and how to do it.
Okay, hey everybody. So there's some more people joining. As you join, please remember to drop your names, pronouns, and where you're from in the chat. Also, if you have any questions, I'm gonna be talking for a bit and I can talk a lot. So ask your questions in the chat because we will get to it. So I love where Larissa left off with challenging hierarchy, because I think that when we think about how do we show up as people of color and for people of color, what do we have to do? And we're kind of having to, again, deconstruct and challenge a hierarchy that has always existed for us to be able to move forward and to obtain a more peaceful world and a more liberated world. So as an activist and organizer for a Black liberation movement for a bit over 5 years now, I've engaged in a plethora of different ways to organize, specifically activism through civic engagement. Now, that sounds really colluded, clouded, whatever word you want to use. But I have been able to protest, attend on podcasts, rally, do sit-ins, write LTEs, host community events, be on roundtables, panels, engage in multimedia campaigns, and lobbied, right? I love lobbying. I probably say it's my favorite thing to do in pastime. When Larissa used to be my supervisor, I held a bird dog training, which is another form of it, in civic engagement and activism. And I love talking to my representatives because it's one of the ways I feel that I can make a direct change and an impact, specifically as a person of color who usually doesn't have the opportunity to go and speak to our legislators on a regular basis. So, and excuse me, you might see me taking a few sips of water because I like to talk a lot. So this is not my first conversation today. But as an organizer, I pretty much come to recognize that participating in different social movements is a lot of work, but it also is the biggest way to make an essential and lasting change where we can really center communal voices. So I think one of the biggest ways to challenge that hierarchy that Larissa was mentioning earlier is to center people who may not be able to have access to power. That could be a plethora of different communities, right? We can think of people who identify as Black, Pacific Islander, Asian, different disabilities. If you identify as LGBT or any part of that spectrum, like there's so many ways in which we are oftentimes disenfranchised. So the biggest way of advocating for change, specifically for Black and Brown folk globally, is to really challenge that hierarchy. And challenging that hierarchy means really kind of decentering ourselves. So how we kind of decenter ourselves at FCNL, which is one of the oldest and largest Quaker organizations in the nation, is we really focus on working with people who have their boots down on the ground. The people who are doing the works in their community, who are taking action, who really care about their local issues. And we're asking them if they will help us center some of these federal policies, some of these issues that are not only impacting us here in America, but that are also impacting us globally. For example, and if you're registered and attending Spring Lobby Weekend, which Larissa will talk more about, if we're advocating for pathways to citizenship, then our advocacy should be centered in those who are most impacted by immigration laws and by ICE, and people who are Black and who are brown, who are refugees, who come here legally, and who come here when they were at birth, people who are considered criminal, right? I think that if we're advocating for pathways to citizenship, then we're advocating alongside and with those voices in the forefront of every movement. Specifically because we want to make sure that there's not only one reflection of who gets access to citizenship, right? Because nobody's a monolithic, and we're all pretty polyolithic, I would say myself. So when we're doing that work, we want to be mindful to make sure that we're encouraging everybody to use their voice and to take a step forward to advocating not only for change here, but what does that mean to advocate for change that will also impact people globally? So another factor to be mindful of when advocating for large movements or within movements is how do we advocate in an intergenerational and a multicultural kind of space? Because oftentimes, and again, going back to that hierarchy Larissa was talking about, it's oftentimes when we're advocating and we're saying, hey, we really want to challenge racism, we want to challenge militarism, right? We also have to challenge what's kind of conventional spaces in which we organize in. So oftentimes when we organize, we see older people who are leading the movements. Yet if you're a younger person or a millennial like myself, it's most of the time younger people who've been able to take charge of movements, who've been able to be at the forefront, who are making the calls, who are knocking on doors, which is my least favorite part of advocacy. If you notice, I didn't mention on that. But the people who are making the calls, who are knocking on doors, those are always the people who are the young folk. And it's always Black and brown people who are on the forefront of tons of movements globally. So it wasn't, white people who were marching in the streets at first and saying Black Lives Matter, right? It was Black people who were out here doing that. And of course, different allies and accomplices and associates and academics also started to engage in this movement as well. So in doing this work, we also have to make sure that we're not only centering voices of color, people who are only marginalized, but we also need to make sure that we're supporting intergenerational advocacy and what that looks like. I think of March for Our Lives as one of the best, greatest intergenerational advocacy movements of our time right now, because that was started by high schoolers who decided I was tired of waiting for adults to make the decisions that most impacted my life. It was the MLKs, the Claudette Colvins, the Emma Gonzalez, the India Moores who created this space that allows us to use our voice and to speak up. So I think that it's really cool when we think about how do we challenge the hierarchy, because it's not only Black and brown people saying, hey, let's challenge racism. It's older people, it's younger people, it's people across different diasporas and people from different communities coming together and saying, hey, we want to do this work. And once we can kind of get together on that same basis, grassroots activism is probably the most fun things to engage in because it's so lively. So like I said, I can talk for days. I'm going to talk your ears off. But I want to transition for us to really understand some other ways in which we can really start challenging racism and militarism right now. And so my favorite thing to talk about is intersectionality, because Kimberly Crenshaw was one of the nicest people I've ever met. That's my clout thing to drop in today's bucket, is I met Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think it was really cool because she got me to understand what does it look like for me to take my advocacy a step forward, not only as being a Black person, but not only, but being a woman, being a person who grew up in a multi-generational household, being a person whose grandpa immigrated here from Trinidad. I think about all of those things every time I enter my advocacy. And so one of my strongest points where I focus a lot of my advocacy on, and I think the advocacy teams, which is the part of the organization I work with, and FCNL also focuses organization on, is how do we kind of, take steps back from being such a militarized state? How do we do better and say, you know what, forget all this fighting, let's just give hugs. And so I think I'm very honored to be in a kind of space where we can take a look back at ourselves and say, hey, I don't want to be this person anymore. And I'm not saying as an individual, I'm saying as a country, we don't want to present as these people anymore. So how do we do that work and change that? So some of my favorite advocates, as I already mentioned, MLK, but there's Gandhi, Patrisse Cullors, Josephine Baker, and Audre Lorde. I've learned a ton of things from them, specifically on what it looks like and what it means to advocate in a militarized and police state. Their perspectives, which were way more wide than mine, have allowed us to focus on what does it mean for peace, justice, and love. If y'all know, Bell Hooks recently passed away, and her whole focus in her advocacy is how do we advocate in love? How do we really challenge that hierarchy that says, hey, we need to be separatists and we need to be individuals and kind of conquer what we're going through before we can just lead in love. And so I love all of those organizers that I just recently named, specifically because they already had that forethought and they were already moving in alignment to how do we do this work in love and faith and care and peace and injustice for all. So over the last 2 decades, Congress has had us messed up, y'all. And they have been doing some things that you probably didn't know because I didn't know before I worked here. So over the last 2 decades, they passed 2 war authorization acts after 9/11 that really caused a lot of harm to Black and Brown people globally. And while doing that, in 2015, Saudi Arabia decided that they were going to uphold a blockade in Yemen. And the US sat complicitly in this while we have allowed different military weapon cells, while Yemen is actually experiencing the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now, which was stated by the UN. And as a Quaker organization, we're not in support of anything that actually causes harm to anybody, any person globally, and even in Mars, which is a little joke that we have. Because when we think about how to challenge hierarchy, we don't allow complacency, right? If we're challenging hierarchy, that means we're not okay with the status quo. We're not okay with what's always existed because it's existed. And so at FCNL, I think it allows us to really think about how do we really change what has always been the standard and move to something that is more transformative. So as we think about specifically where we stand in the US, I think it's also important because we're being hosted in Hawaii right now. And I've never been to Hawaii. I would love to go. But I think that Hawaii is a huge aspect to think about advocacy, specifically militarization. There's so much people don't know about Hawaii, like myself, before I started talking to Jose, is, you think of it as this beautiful tropical island where, coconuts fall and you can look out into the beach and you can hop island to island and tour, right? But there's a huge history on the reason why Hawaii is even an American state at all. And I think it's really important to recognize. So let's kind of go into this visioning session. If you ever watched the Amanda show, she used to have these throwbacks where you can think about and revision where she was. And so let's kind of go into that little swirly memory patch. In August 12th, 1898, Hawaii actually became a U.S. official territory. So this happened because this one guy from Nevada, which I'm not proud to claim, but I'm going to claim him today. This one guy from Nevada decided to write a resolution regarding Hawaii's political situation, saying that, hey, we need to be in Hawaii because it allows us to really protect Americans. And Hawaii, you know what? They can't even protect their own people right now. We need to intervene. So that's pretty much what this guy from Nevada said, which again, if you're from Nevada, please don't claim him. I'm not even going to give you his name because we don't want to claim him over here. But when that happened, it was a huge, huge impact for Hawaii because for the most part, Hawaii had always been independently ran. They were a really peaceful country. And first off, let's also talk about Hawaii and having one of the first women to lead the whole island. So there's so much that was going on that was wonderful in Hawaii. But America saw that Hawaii could be a central place for us to set up military grounds, specifically so that we can really think about how we interacted with different people specifically attached to the Pacific Ocean, people in East Asia, China, Japan, North and South Korea, Mongolia, Taiwan, and so many other places. America really wanted to have a space that was kind of central so that if anything were to happen or we needed access to different military sources and trades, that we would have a space to do that, which is kind of why we decided to make Hawaii a state. But if we fast forward and start thinking about the militarization of the state over time, from 1898 to about 1941, Hawaii became a militarized place, specifically a territory with no access to the same rights as U.S. constituents, but yet it was a huge place where we had a military basis. So during Pearl Harbor, when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, the U.S. military decided to expand their powers, and they declared martial law in Hawaii until 1944. So there was a lot of things happening in Hawaii that made it a really huge militarized state. You might know some people who went to the military after college or after high school, and then they were based in Hawaii for a while, specifically because of the way that we had military powers that were centered in having access in Hawaii. So if you can think about, we did that to one of the places that we consider our own home, right? A part of America, part of our state, that we essentially colonized Hawaii and dislocated Native Hawaiians through our ventures of the Pacific Ocean, then we can only imagine what we're allowing to happen globally. And so there's more stuff that I can possibly share with you, and I'll drop a link in the chat a little bit later on where I was getting a lot of this information about Hawaii. But I think there's a lot of information about Hawaii that kind of allows us to set ground and really think about how we picture ourselves in other spaces. As I said, I work in the advocacy teams, and thus far, I kind of became a Yemen nut. So I became a person who loves to talk about Yemen because I never realized how connected my direct experience here in America was to another place globally. And it's specifically a place where I didn't center Black and Brown people concerns or even think if they had issues there. So I love being part of the advocacy teams, specifically because I get to think about things that I love. I love criminal justice reform. I love abolition, and I love to talk about these things. And one thing I realized within working in the Yemen campaign is that we didn't talk about, and oftentimes in America, we don't talk about the harm that's caused in other countries. So as I said earlier, we've been complicit in a long war in Yemen. Now it's been about 7 years that this war has been ongoing, and we've been here complicit, selling different types of military weapon and manufacturing to Saudi Arabia. But just 2 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia launched an air missile that actually killed 70 people in a Yemeni prison. Out of those 70 people, a majority of them were African migrants who were trying to head up north to find access to work. And so I bring this up to say is that there's a lot of global intersectional issues that we all care about. I care about prison rights here in America, but I didn't know that these things were happening in Yemen to care for. And so now that I know that these things are here to care for, I have vowed to use my voice, not only to speak about the injustices here, but to speak about the injustices globally. So I've talked your ears off. I told you I was going to do that because that's like my favorite thing to do. I want to take the time to possibly put y'all into some breakout groups because I think that it's also important that you hear from each other. So I'm going to ask Jose back because he has to make sure that you all can talk to each other. I don't have that capacity. But what we're going to do is we're going to place you in breakout groups soon where you're going to be able to answer the question, what can you do as individuals to demilitarize your community and specifically to demilitarize communities of color? So if you give me just 2 seconds, we'll go ahead and put you all in some breakout groups. There'll be about 3 or 4 breakout groups where you can all participate in. And I hope to be able to speak with you all soon. Larissa, before I go, is there anything in the chat that I can answer?
I don't think so. I think, was this Jose who put something in the chat? Oh, yes. Just reminding you to share questions in the chat if you have them. Thank you, Jose. And I really I'm hearing so much passion from you, Jameelah, as you're talking about Yemen. I know that like the advocacy teams changes issue every year. So it's awesome to like see how much you've already like kind of realized that militarization is such a problem outside of the US and in other areas, like you said, like making those connections. So, I mean, you are saying a bunch of stuff that I was learning a lot from you as you were talking, and we put this presentation together. So I really appreciate your knowledge, Jameelah. And I'll say that, you know, at the beginning, I said, like, how do we challenge racism? And we talked about challenging hierarchy. Jameelah mentioned centering directly impacted communities, which also helps challenge hierarchy. And now what I love about this portion of our talk is we're talking about demilitarizing now, which is also a way of challenging racism. And I think the first step is what Jameelah just took us through, understanding the problem of militarization and more specifically hearing how that pertains to the issue that Jameelah is working on right now and organizing people around.
Hey everybody. Honestly, I had a great conversation. I had a lovely conversation, and I would love to hear about what some of you and your other groups were able to talk about. Like I said, I can talk your ears off, but I'd love to hear even from people in the group I was in or from other groups about what did you think about and what option or what tactics did you all come up with to demilitarize your communities of color in your state? And I will call on people.
I was just going to say, you all should be able to unmute yourselves now, so please feel free. Thank you.
It's the Quaker way for us to lean into silence. So the more quiet y'all are, I know the more thought you're in. And that means I'm getting really excited to call on one of you all.
You can also put your thoughts in the chat if you don't want to unmute.
Well, I'm going to call on somebody from our group then. How about that? Because I really like Roman, I would like Roman, who's in Hawaii. And I really like to hear about like some of your experiences. What do you think you could do in your community?
Well, there's something happening right now that could be the start of demilitarization in Hawaii. There's some activists who've been on this issue for a while, but we had a contamination of our drinking water over here by military fuel tanks. I think we're like 6 or 8 of them were 100,000 gallons each or some preposterous things. And they sicken a lot of military families. It's funny that they didn't go to the civilian population, but them. So our Congress people now are saying, drain them and shut them down. And the military is kind of resisting that procedurally a little bit, taking it to court and so forth. But that's a huge event over here that could change the dialogue and what's happening in Hawaii as far as our relationship to the military. Because the military was very deceptive, I think, with us, kind of pushed the problem under the rug until their own family started getting sick and complaining. And they didn't do anything for like 2 or 3 months. Yeah.
You know,
thousands of military families living outside in hotels because it's not safe. The water's not safe for them. I think they're cleaning up pretty soon, but wow. Yeah, that's a big opportunity in what's happening. But as I was also saying, the military is so huge over here economically. I think it's 30% of the economy or something like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And then Karen, would you like to share?
I just wanted to say that I think this is a problem that many communities that have military bases or have had military bases in the past have faced, is the pollution that's left by a base or that's created by a base. And I believe there was something that went through Congress just in the last few days to address the environmental impact of military presence, that is something that needs to be part of how those systems operate, especially environmentally. And gee, I'd love to see military personnel cleaning up the bases and training to do environmental cleanup that they could train other people to do as part of their work as military people. And then as trainers out in the community, so they can do something besides kill people for their job after they leave the military. So we have a pool of labor, we have a bunch of problems, and we have problems that, like that, with toxic sites that on an ongoing basis do need to have trained people to deal with them. So anyway, our group talked a lot about women, about the importance of the role of women in not only our own communities where we need more women in police forces and who decide about training of police and who monitor and decide about equipment of police, so that we don't have people facing tanks out there on the streets of Portland in the future, please. We have somebody in our group, was that Carol? I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, who works with the Korean organization and really shared something very important about women's groups in North Korea working for peace and stability. So I don't know if she wants to share that, but that was really a good piece of information.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing with us. If Carol or anyone else would like to share, we do have about like 2 more minutes where we can hear from somebody. And then I love that you were kind of getting us going on the environmental justice side, because that is where Larissa is about to school y'all. So anyone else would like to speak? Okay. Carol, yes.
Oh no, I just want to, sorry, I'm in the library, so my talking is like really minimal, but I really appreciate this space and you all here today and what was said. I think our group kind of had the theme of talking about linking foreign policy and domestic policy and understanding the ways in which the United States conducts foreign policy and has so many wars. You know, it really does affect the environment. It does affect our domestic citizens, you know, who have to pay these taxes or deal with inflation and all these things that, and you know, send our children and bodies and troops abroad, particularly of BIPOC folks. So I think it's really important for us to have this vision of a world where we can build relationships rather than, you know, battleships. So that's kind of what I have to say.
And you gave my supervisor the best idea. I don't know if you saw her face. She's, because she was like, look, already in the chat, what a phrase, relationships rather than battleships. I promise you it's going to be on one of our taglines. So we will try to give you credit, Carol. Thank you so much. You all had wonderful conversation. I really appreciate like all the ideas that you're giving. I didn't even think about like, when we're talking about this hierarchy and challenging hierarchy and racism and militarism, what does it look like to have more women in leadership? And so I appreciate those thoughts. That being said, I'm going to pass the mic to Larissa to get started a minute early, may I say. And I hope that the rest of y'all enjoy this conversation, because next time I'll be in a chat room near you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jameelah. Okay, so this is not the last you're going to hear of Jameelah, but we are now going to move on to my portion of things. And while Jameelah and I are on the same team, like we've said, we have different focuses. I'm not sure that that's the plural, but anyway, I am currently working on environmental justice. I said that we are organizing around environmental justice in the young adult program. In our network, we have 18 organizers that we hired for a period of a year. And this is called the Advocacy Core Program. The issue changes every year, but right now they're working on environmental justice. And this has given me such a interesting opportunity to think more about how we challenge racism through policy. So Jameelah just summed it up for us, but I'll do it again. I don't think it's wrong to hear these things more than once, twice, or 3 times, right? We're challenging hierarchy. We are demilitarizing our communities. And I want to talk now about fostering community autonomy. I was in my group, actually, we talked a little bit about how recentering communities is going to be important, not just in demilitarizing a state or a community, like recentering the people that live there and their experiences, but also in general to challenge racism and systems of oppression in all facets, right? So what is environmental justice? There are two definitions that I like to give, okay? There is the official Environmental Protection Agency definition, and that is generally what you'll hear and you'll see. And the reason I say it's official, I'm previewing, there's more than just that definition, is because this really is where we see what environmental justice could look like as a policy initiative. But it is so much more than just a policy initiative, and we'll talk about that. So the official definition is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that is a long definition, but basically the definition really focuses on the meaningful involvement in laws, regulations, and policies. So they are viewing environmental justice as being accomplished through these structures and making sure that people, regardless of all of these factors, all of these identities, are involved in a meaningful way in creating those policies, implementing them. However, environmental justice is also a larger movement. Environmental justice also pertains to how we relate to each other, right? And so I want to read a little bit from this document titled The Principles of Environmental Justice. And this was put together by the Multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. There are 17 principles. I'm not going to read all of them to you because I don't think anyone wants to sit through the 17. However, I would really recommend you look all of them up. I mean, there are 17 for a reason, and I had trouble picking out which ones to read, but I have 4 that I'm going to read to you all. So first, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Second, environmental justice demands that public policy, there's the policy again, be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any form of discrimination or bias. The next one, environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all peoples. And the last one that I'm going to read, because it directly ties to the militarization conversation we just had, environmental justice opposes military occupation, repression, and exploitation of lands, peoples, and cultures, and other life forms. So you can hear that this is beyond just the meaningful involvement in policy. It is about rethinking how we relate to each other as well, which something that Carol said was, Carol, you're filling us with so much knowledge, you're giving us so much wisdom. Something you said really got me thinking on that track. It's about the way that we not only treat each other, but in the environmental justice sense, it's also about how we relate to the earth. So what does environmental justice challenge us to do? First, it challenges us to imagine a world that is very different from the one we live in now. I mean, that last one I read, environmental justice opposes military occupation. There was more to that, but I'll just stop right there. We do not live in a world that has no military occupation, right? There is military occupation in the world. And that reason alone because of these principles would lead us to think, okay, we do not live in a world that is environmentally just. So when I first discovered these principles, that's where I felt very challenged. I thought, wow, this is beautiful. These principles are challenging racism, dismantling hierarchy. I mean, it is envisioning a world where, you know, if I were to read all 17, you would hear where there is no hierarchy, for example. But that was really difficult to imagine because we just don't live in a world like that, right? And not that we shouldn't, but we don't right now. And so that's why environmental justice really challenges us. Let's think beyond the systems that we currently live in. I said right at the beginning when I was talking about hierarchy, we do not live in a world without hierarchy. So when we're imagining how to challenge it, we're still living in a system that is hierarchical. We're challenging it within that system, just as I sit here today, you know, in my apartment. But we are challenged by environmental justice to think beyond that. Okay, if there were no hierarchy, what would that mean? So how would decisions be made? Who's in charge? Maybe there's no one in charge, right? These are all questions that you start to ask yourself when you read all of these principles. And like I already said, environmental justice challenges us as well to remember that it's more than just what policy solutions do we have at our disposal. It's about how we treat each other. There was a provision in here that I didn't read, but it is related to the ways that Indigenous people have always and continue to relate to the earth, right? So they have a relationship with the earth where it is about taking care of the earth so the earth takes care of us. It is reciprocal. And under systems of oppression and systems of capitalism that we have currently in place, we do not have that reciprocal nature with earth. We do not have that reciprocal relationship with the earth. We are taking and we are not necessarily taking care. And that I'm relating it to Mother Earth because we're talking environmental justice, but you can hear how that can apply to basically any role that you occupy in your life and any system that you find yourself in. So the policy itself that we're working on, right? I'm talking high level right here, like the beautiful world that environmental justice envisions. Okay, now let's talk policy. I know I kept saying it's beyond policy, it's beyond policy. It's because that to me is really important. For me, like we gotta name that at the front of conversations about environmental justice. Part of environmental justice, really embracing it, is embracing that policy solutions will not be the only thing that gets us to this beautiful world that we envision. So the bill that we're working on, I previewed it a little bit earlier. It is called the Environmental Justice for All Act. So this bill is in both the House and the Senate, and it does a lot of things. For example, it actually authorizes more funding for community groups that are working on environmental justice initiatives, climate policy initiatives on the ground. So I said earlier, we're going to talk about fostering community autonomy. This bill does that. It recenters the community, acknowledges that not only did they know what they needed because they helped write the bill, but part of what they need is more funding and resources so they can continue doing their work. Knowing that communities who are directly impacted know what solutions will work for them. And it's not a matter of a bill telling them what solutions they need, it's empowering them. And someone one time told me that they don't like the word empower, they like the word co-power. So co-powering them to continue doing that work. And that really stood out to me when they corrected me one time on using the word empower. You know, they said, there is power already there. It's about creating space and being alongside those communities as they do what they need to do and take care of themselves in the way that they know they need. So this policy also gives more power back to communities by actually amending the Civil Rights Act so that communities have more avenues to seek legal remedy for environmental injustices. So what is an environmental injustice? There might be a low-income neighborhood. That neighborhood might be predominantly Black and Brown folks, and there might be 2, 3 different waste disposal sites in the area. Why are there 2 or 3 waste disposal sites in the area disproportionately impacting those communities? Because there are not enough regulations that make it so the communities where it is cheapest for them to build these things are not then surrounded by waste, surrounded by pollution. So that is one example of an injustice that this bill really tries to help communities be able to seek more legal remedy when they realize that something like that is happening, right? So, you know, the way it was written actually challenges hierarchy. And I mentioned that earlier, and it fosters community autonomy. I won't go over that again. I did say it earlier, don't want to be too much of a broken record. But the provisions of the bill itself also foster that community autonomy. So what I think is cool about this bill is that it was written in a way that upholds the principles of environmental justice. And it was written in a way that would hopefully also, you know, if it were passed, create provisions that also uphold those, what is the word I'm trying to think of? Principles of environmental justice. So, you know, this bill, like I said, is currently in the Senate and also in the House. It hasn't moved very much. And why is that? Because people don't know that much about it. Climate policy has gone through so many evolutions, right? It used to be called global warming, then we called it climate change. People tried to come up with different solutions to climate change. And in the middle of all of those solutions, no one quite took that step back to determine if the solutions were equitable, who was being disproportionately impacted by those solutions, which is really interesting because it's not just, oh, there's climate change issues that impact these communities disproportionately. No, the solutions that are attempted by Congress and by other decision makers are also creating disproportionate harm to the communities that are already disproportionately impacted. So that's why environmental justice is so important in policy, and how it works to challenge racism in policy as a challenge racism as a policy initiative, right? And I think I was gonna say one more thing about that. Oh, in my group, we also, like earlier, we also talked about how spaces like this are so important because the flow of these ideas is so important. The educating peer-to-peer that happens in moments like this are so important. Like, I said earlier, Jameelah, I learned so much from you in this moment, and it's something that I really embrace in all of these spaces is you show up to learn from each other. And peer-to-peer education is so important because that is how you kind of spread the ideas of a larger movement, make sure we're all on the same page, and working towards the same goals. So something that we're doing in our advocacy right now is some of that education, is making sure environmental justice is at the forefront of all climate policy conversations, because right now it just isn't yet. And it has to be. So I'm gonna just read the principles of environmental justice one more time. And then for this second breakout session where y'all gonna talk a little bit more, I want you to envision, what does an environmentally just world look like? And what are obstacles in our way? So here it is in the chat. And I'm going to read the principles one more time so you have them fresh in your head for the conversation. So we have, again, just 4 of them out of the 17. Environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Excuse me. Environmental justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any form of discrimination or bias. Environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all peoples. Environmental justice opposes military occupation, repression, and exploitation of lands, peoples, and cultures, and other life forms. Okay, so what does an environmentally just world look like? And what are some obstacles in our way of achieving that world? All right, I see our group is getting more and more intimate, which makes sense. It's been an hour and 23 minutes that we've been together. I don't want to say time flies when you're having fun, because that's really cliche, and I don't know if that's the right word to use. It's more like I've just been so deep in thought and conversation with all of you that yeah, now we're at time, and I'm really surprised. So I'm really, really thankful for those of you who have stayed until the end here. And I do want to give Jameelah and I some time to wrap up and talk about some opportunities that you might want to take advantage of to good ideas fly when you are having fun. Oh, I like that in the chat. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, some opportunities that you might want to take advantage of to advocate with us in some capacity. So is there one person that wants to share something that they talked about in their group? Okay, go ahead, Karen.
We talked about the military and how they're really an international force for I don't know about protection, but they're an international force, and they're an international source of pollution. They don't have to have that role. They can be resources for communities to bring in materials and develop manufacturing for technology that they would need in their Green New Deal programs, with technicians and training offered to the community on the military bases. So you know, to remake the military as a force for construction rather than destruction. They certainly are the ones with the money. So, you know, let's do something else besides kill people with that. And the other thing was, again, about asking people what they need, because especially if you ask women, what do you need in your community? They'll tell you, and then you try and help them get that thing, and then they do the thing that they need to do with it. You know, pretty straightforward.
Thank you. Okay, I do see another hand. I want to apologize. I don't want to go over, and I really want to wrap up here. So if you want to throw your idea or question in the chat, then we can still all take a look at it and share in whatever knowledge you were going to give us. I'm so sorry, Mary Lou. Okay, I'll just very quickly say before handing it off to Jameelah that like Jose mentioned, I'm the young adult program manager at FCNL. So I'm really focused on creating opportunities for and with young adults in our network. So if you're a young adult and you're interested in any sort of advocacy, potentially a paid program that we have, you can check that out at fcnl.org/young-adult. And I'm just going to put that in the chat. I know that you will get some sort of follow-up from us, but there it is in case you're interested. And exactly what Sarah just put in the chat, thank you, Sarah. Our big thing that's happening right now in the young adult program is Spring Lobby Weekend. So that is March 12th to the 15th, very soon. Stressful to hear as one of the planners, but it is exciting because we will be advocating for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. We know there are 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, and there is no pathway to citizenship for any of them. So we will be putting all of our training that we go through that weekend and community building to, I guess, push forward with that issue. And if you're interested in registering, you can come to DC and be part of the in-person event, but there's also an online version. We will be hosting a hybrid event. And so you can indicate that in the registration form. Go ahead, Jameelah. Tell us about your opportunities and yeah, send us out, I guess. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Larissa. If you can, please go sign up for those opportunities. Share those opportunities Larissa just mentioned. That's how I got engaged with FCNL as a young organizer and learned so much of my skills that I was able to share with you all today. So please go ahead and take these opportunities, especially if you're looking for an extra dollar, because I think I want to apply for the advocacy team, the advocacy corps next year. But as I'm messing up and talking about the advocacy teams, that's because that's under my umbrella. So I'm the advocacy team organizer, as I said earlier, and I go around the country starting different advocacy teams filled with people who really want to make a change in the world, specifically people who are really advocating for peace and for justice. You do not have to be a Quaker to organize with us. All you have to do is have heart. I think that's really important because when I think about the advocacy team, it's filled with people who just really want to see a difference in their communities and in their country. We have other people here from the advocacy teams. I wish I can shout out everyone. I feel like I'm Oprah, like just giving out shout outs. But Mary Lou Hatcher is part of an advocacy team. Sarah Freeman Wilpert is my supervisor. And this is pretty much kind of how we always are, is we're always talking, we're always using these ideas to think about how we can actually make change and implement that change in our communities. So we might have this big federal legislative universal goal, right? And we're always sitting here thinking about, but what can we do today in the present, right? And I think that if you are a young adult, if you're someone who's older, if you're somebody who might be a career person who is a little bit busy and you're looking for a fun way to engage with other people, other locals in your community, the advocacy team is definitely the way to go about. But with that being said, I just like to say thank you all for joining us today. It was great talking to you. You will be getting a follow-up email probably from Jose. And then once we get all your emails collected, Larissa and I will definitely be sending y'all out some individual correspondence. In the meantime, between time, I'm going to go ahead and drop my email here in the chat for everyone to contact me if you're interested in the advocacy teams. And I can also drop Larissa's as well.
Thank you. I was about to put it in there, but I'm glad you got it.
All right. With that being said, bye, everyone. I love you so much. Sending you hugs, sending you love. Happy Black History Month. Remember to lead in love, like Bell Hooks said. So when I tell you I love you, I really mean it. And I appreciate you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Larissa and Jameelah, for allowing us to learn about your work and the wealth of knowledge you can guide us in, all these multiple peace-related projects. Really appreciate your experiences, the lessons learned, and tips that all of us as future peace builders can kind of take on. And thank you for your kindness and leadership in the field to explore the journey into this profession. And last but not least, thank you everybody who attended today. Greatly appreciate being here to learn further about Careers in Peace Building Talk Story series. Take care, all.